The Fool Killer by O. Henry. Down south, whenever anyone perpetrates some particularly monumental piece of foolishness, everybody says, "Send for Jesse Holmes." Jesse Holmes is the Fool Killer. Of course, he is a myth, like Santa Claus and Jack Frost and general prosperity and all those concrete conceptions that are supposed to represent an idea that nature has failed to embody. The wisest of the Southrons can not tell you whence comes the Fool Killer's name, but few and happy are the households from the Roanoke to the Rio Grande in which the name of Jesse Holmes has not been pronounced or invoked. Always with a smile, and often with a tear, is he summoned to his official duty. A busy man is Jesse Holmes. I remember the clear picture of him that hung on the walls of my fancy during my barefoot days when I was dodging his oft-threatened devoirs. To me, B was a terrible old man, in gray clothes, with a long, ragged, gray beard, and reddish, fierce eyes. I looked to see him come stumping up the road in a cloud of dust, with a white oak staff in his hand and his shoes tied with leather thongs. I may yet. But this is a story, not a sequel. I have taken notice with regret that few stories worth reading have been written that did not contain drink of some sort. Down go the fluids, from Arizona Dick's 3 fingers of red pison to the efficacious oolong that nerves Lionel Montresor to repartee in the dotty dialogues. So, in such good company I may introduce an absinthe drip. One absinthe drip, dripped through a silver dripper, orderly, opalescent, cool, green-eyed, deceptive. Kerner was a fool. Besides that, he was an artist and my good friend. Now, if there is one thing on earth utterly despicable to another, it is an artist in the eyes of an author whose story he has illustrated. Just try it once. Write a story about a mining camp in Idaho. Sell it. Spend the money, and then, 6 months later, borrow a quarter or a dime, and buy the magazine containing it. You find a full-page wash drawing of your hero, Black Bill, the cowboy. Somewhere in your story you employed the word horse. Aha! The artist has grasped the idea. Black Bill has on the regulation trousers of the M.F.H. of the Westchester County Hunt. He carries a parlor rifle and wears a monocle. In the distance is a section of 42nd Street during a search for a lost gas pipe, and the Taj Mahal, the famous mausoleum in India. Enough. I hated Kerner, and one day I met him, and we became friends. He was young and gloriously melancholy because his spirits were so high and life bad so much in store for him. Yes, he was almost riotously sad. That was his youth. When a man begins to be hilarious in a sorrowful way, you can bet $1,000,000 that he is dyeing his hair. Kerner's hair was plentiful and carefully matted as an artist's thatch should be. He was a cigaretteur, and B audited his dinners with red wine. But, most of all, B was a fool. And wisely, I envied him, and listened patiently while he knocked Velasquez and Tintoretto. Once he told me that he liked a story of mine that he bad come across in an anthology. He described it to me, and I was sorry that Mr. James O'Brien was dead, and could not learn of the eulogy of his work. But mostly Kerner made few breaks and was a consistent fool. I'd better explain what I mean by that. There was a girl. Now, a girl, as far as I am concerned, is a thing that belongs in a seminary or an album, but I conceded the existence of the animal in order to retain Kerner's friendship. He showed me her picture in a locket. She was a blonde or a brunette. I have forgotten which. She worked in a factory for $8 a week. Lest factories quote this wage by way of vindication, I will add that the girl bad worked for 5 years to reach that supreme elevation of remuneration, beginning at $1.50 per week. Kerner's father was worth a couple of millions. He was willing to stand for art, but he drew the line at the factory girl. So Kerner disinherited his father and walked out to a cheap studio and lived on sausages for breakfast and on Ferroni for dinner. Ferroni had the artistic soul and a line of credit for painters and poets, nicely adjusted. Sometimes Kerner sold a picture and bought some new tapestry, a ring and a dozen silk cravats, and paid Ferroni $2 on account. One evening Kerner had me to dinner with himself and the factory girl. They were to be married as soon as Kerner could slosh paint profitably. As for the ex-father's $2 million, poof, she was a wonder. Small and halfway pretty, and as much at her ease in that cheap cafe as though she were only in the Palmer House, Chicago, with a souvenir spoon already safely hidden in her shirt waist. She was natural. Two things I noticed about her especially. Her belt buckle was exactly in the middle of her back, and she didn't tell us that a large man with a ruby stick pin had followed her up all the way from 14th Street. Was Kerner such a fool? I wondered. And then I thought of the quantity of striped cuffs and blue glass beads that $2 million can buy for the heathen, and I said to myself that he was. And then Elise, certainly that was her name, told us, merrily, that the brown spot on her waist was caused by her landlady knocking at the door while she, the girl, confound the English language, was heating an iron over the gas jet, and she hid the iron under the bedclothes until the coast was clear, and there was the piece of chewing gum stuck to it when she began to iron the waist, and, well, I wondered how in the world the chewing gum came to be there. Don't they ever stop chewing it? A while after that, don't be impatient, Sin the drip is coming now. Kerner and I were dining at Ferroni's. A mandolin and a guitar were being attacked. The room was full of smoke in nice, long, crinkly layers, just like the artists draw the steam from a plum pudding on Christmas posters, and a lady in a blue silk and gasolined gauntlets was beginning to bum an air from the Catskills. Kerner, said I, you are a fool. Of course, said Kerner, I wouldn't let her go on working. Not my wife. What's the use to wait? She's willing. I sold that watercolor of the Polly, Sada's yesterday. We could cook on a 2-burner gas stove. You know the ragouts I can throw together? Yes, I think we will marry next week. Kerner, said I, you are a fool. Have an absinthe drip, said Kerner, grandly. Tonight you are the guest of art in paying quan titties. I think we will get a flat with a bath. I never tried one. I mean an absinthe drip, said I. The waiter brought it and poured the water slowly over the ice in the dripper. It looks exactly like the Mississippi River water in the Big Bend below Natchez, said I, fascinated, gazing at the bemuddled drip. There are such flats for $8 a week, said Kerner. You are a fool, said I, and began to sip the filtration. What you need, I continued, is the official attention of one Jesse Holmes. Kerner, not being a Southerner, did not compare Hind, so he sat, sentimental, figuring on his flat in his sordid, artistic way, while I gazed into the green eyes of the sophisticated spirit of Wormwood. Presently I noticed casually that a procession of bacchantes limned on the wall immediately below the ceiling had begun to move, traversing the room from right to left in a gay and spectacular pilgrimage. I did not confide my discovery to Kerner. The artistic temperament is too high-strung to view such devia, tie-ins from the natural laws of the art of calcimining. I sipped my absinthe drip and sawed wormwood. One absinthe drip is not much, but I said again to Kerner kindly, you are a fool. And then, in the vernacular, Jesse Holmes for yours. And then I looked around and saw the fool killer, as he had always appeared to my imagination, sitting at a nearby table and regarding us with his reddish, fatal, relentless eyes. He was Jesse Holmes from top to toe. He had the long, gray, ragged beard, the gray clothes of ancient cut, the executioner's look, and the dusty shoes of one who had been called from afar. His eyes were turned fixedly upon Kerner. I shuddered to think that I had invoked him from his assiduous southern duties. I thought of flying, and then I kept my seat, reflecting that many men caped his ministrations when it seemed that nothing short of an appointment as ambassador to Spain could save them from him. I had called my brother Kerner a fool and was in danger of hell-fire. That was nothing, but I would try to save him from Jesse Holmes. The fool killer got up from his table and came over to ours. He rested his hands upon it and turned his burning, vindictive eyes upon Kerner, nowhereing me. You are a hopeless fool, he said to the artist. Haven't you had enough of starvation yet? I have, fair you one more opportunity. Give up this girl and come back to your home. Refuse, and you must take the consequences. The fool killer's threatening face was within a foot of his victim's, but to my horror, Kerner made not the slightest sign of being aware of his presence. We will be married next week, he muttered absent-mindedly. With my studio furniture and some secondhand stuff we can make out. You have decided your own fate, said the fool killer, in a low but terrible voice. You may consider yourself as one dead. You have had your last chance. In the moonlight, went on Kerner, softly, we will sit under the skylight with our guitar and sing away the false delights of pride and money. On your own head be it, hissed the fool killer, and my scalp prickled when I perceived that neither Kerner's eyes nor his ears took the slightest cognizance of Jesse Holmes. And then I knew that for some reason the veil had been lifted for me alone, and that I had been elected to save my friend from destruction at the fool killer's bands. Something of the fear and wonder of it must have showed itself in my face. Excuse me, said Kerner, with his wan, amiable smile. Was I talking to myself? I think it is getting to be a habit with me. The fool killer turned and walked out of far, Ronald's. Wait here for me, said I, rising. I must speak to that man. Had you no answer for him? Because you are a fool, must you die like a mouse under his foot? Could you not utter one squeak in your own defense? You are drunk, said Kerner, heartlessly. No one addressed me. The destroyer of your mind, said I, stood above you just now and marked you for his victim. You are not blind or deaf. I recognized no such person, said Kerner. I have seen no one but you at this table. Sit down. Hereafter you shall have no more absinthe drips. Wait here, said I, furious. If you don't care for your own life, I will save it for you. I hurried out and overtook the man in gray half, way down the block. He looked as I had seen him in my fancy 1,000 times, truculent, gray, and awful. He walked with the white oak staff, and but for the street sprinkler the dust would have been flying under his tread. I caught him by the sleeve and steered him to a dark angle of a building. I knew he was a myth, and I did not want a cop to see me conversing with V.A. Cancy, for I might land in Bellevue, minus my silver matchbox and diamond ring. Jesse Holmes, said I, facing him with apparent bravery, I know you. I have heard of you all my life. I know now what a scourge you have been to your country. Instead of killing fools, you have been murdering the youth and genius that are necessary to make a people live and grow great. You are a fool yourself, Holmes. You began killing off the brightest and best of our countrymen 3 generations ago, when the old and obsolete standards of society and honor and orthodoxy were narrow and bigoted. You proved that when you put your murderous mark upon my friend Kerner, the wisest chap I ever knew in my life. The fool killer looked at me grimly and closely. You've a queer jag, said he, curiously. Oh, yes, I see who you are now. You were sitting with him at the table. Well, if I'm not mistaken, I heard you call him a fool, too. I did, said I. I delight in doing so. It is from envy. By all the standards that you know, he is the most egregious and grandiloquent and gorgeous fool in all the world. That's why you want to kill him. Would you mind telling me who or what you think I am? Asked the old man. I laughed boisterously and then stopped suddenly, for I remembered that it would not do to be seen so hilarious in the company of nothing but a brick wall. You are Jesse Holmes, the fool killer, I said solemnly, and you are going to kill my friend Kerr. I don't know who rang you up, but if you do kill him, I'll see that you get pinched for it. That is, I added, despairingly, if I can get a cop to see you. They have a poor eye for mortals, and I think it would take the whole force to round up a myth more darer. Well, said the fool killer briskly, I must be going. You had better go home and sleep it off. Good night. At this I was moved by a sudden fear for Kerner to a softer and more pleading mood. I leaned against the gray man's sleeve and besought him, Good Mr. Fool Killer, please don't kill little Kern. Why can't you go back south and kill Gressman and Claycaters and let us alone? Why don't you go up on Fifth Avenue and kill millionaires that keep their money locked up and won't let young fools marry because one of them lives on the wrong street? Come and have a drink, Jesse. Will you never get on to your job? Do you know this girl that your friend has made himself a fool about? Asked the fool killer. I have the honor, said I, and that's why I called Kerner a fool. He is a fool because he has waited so long before marrying her. He is a fool because B has been waiting in the hopes of getting the consent of some absurd $2 million fool parent, or something of the sort. Maybe, said the fool killer, maybe I might have looked at it differently. Would you mind going back to the restaurant and bringing your friend Kerner here? What's the use, Jesse? I yawned. He can't see you. He didn't know you were talking to him at the table. You are a fictitious character, you know? Maybe he can this time. Will you go fetch him? All right, said I, but I've a suspicion that you're not strictly sober, Jesse. You seem to be veering and losing your outlines. Don't vanish before I get back. I went back to Kerner and said, There's a man with an invisible homicidal mania waiting to see you outside. I believe he wants to murder you. Come along. You won't see him, so there's nothing to be frightened about. Kerner looked anxious. Why, said B, I had no idea one absinthe would do that. You'd better stick to Würzburger. I'll walk home with you. I led him to Jesse Holmes's. Rudolph, said the fool killer, I'll give in. Bring her up to the house. Give me your hand, boy. Good for you, Dad, said Kerner, shaking hands with the old man. You'll never regret it after you know her. So, you did see him when he was talking to you at the table? I asked Kerner. We hadn't spoken to each other in a year, said Kerner. It's all right now. I walked away. Where are you going? Called Kerner. I am going to look for Jesse Holmes. I answered, with dignity and reserve. The Flag Paramount, by O. Henry. At the head of the insurgent party appeared that Hector and learned Theban of the southern republics, Don Sabas Placido, a traveler, a soldier, a poet, a scientist, a statesman, and a connoisseur. The wonder was that he could content himself with the petty, remote life of his native country. It is a whim of Placido's, said a friend who knew him well, to take up political intrigue. It is not otherwise than as if he had come upon a new tempo in music, a new bacillus in the air, a new scent, or rhyme, or explosive. He will squeeze this revolution dry of sensations, and a week afterward will forget it, skimming the seas of the world in his brigantine to add to his already world-famous collections. Collections of what?
Por Dios.
Of everything from postage stamps to prehistoric stone idols. But, for a mere dilettante, the aesthetic Placido seemed to be creating a lively row. The people admired him. They were fascinated by his brilliancy and flattered by his taking an interest in so small a thing as his native country. They rallied to the call of his lieutenants in the capital, where, somewhat contrary to arrangements, the army remained faithful to the government. There was also lively skirmishing in the coast towns. It was rumored that the revolution was aided by the Vesuvius Fruit Company, the power that forever stood with chiding smile and uplifted finger to keep Anchuria in the class of good children. Two of its steamers, the Traveler and the Salvador, were known to have conveyed insurgent troops from point to point along the coast. As yet there had been no actual uprising in Coralio. Military law prevailed, and the ferment was bottled for the time. And then came the word that everywhere the revolutionists were encountering defeat. In the capital, the president's forces triumphed, and there was a rumor that the leaders of the revolt had been forced to fly, hotly pursued. In the little telegraph office at Coralio, there was always a gathering of officials and loyal citizens, awaiting news from the seat of government. One morning the telegraph key began clicking, and presently the operator called, loudly, "One telegram for El Almirante, Don Señor Felipe Carrera." There was a shuffling sound, a great rattling of tin scabbard, and the admiral, prompt at his spot of waiting, leaped across the room to receive it. The message was handed to him. Slowly spelling it out, he found it to be his first official order, thus running: "Proceed immediately with your vessel to mouth of Rio Ruiz. Transport beef and provisions to barracks at Alforan. Martinez, General." Small glory, to be sure, in this, his country's first call. But it had called, and joy surged in the admiral's breast. He drew his cutlass belt to another buckle hole, roused his dozing crew, and in a quarter of an hour El Nacional was tacking swiftly down coast in a stiff landward breeze. The Rio Ruiz is a small river, emptying into the sea 10 miles below Coralio. That portion of the coast is wild and solitary. Through a gorge in the Cordilleras rushes the Rio Ruiz, cold and bubbling, to glide at last, with breadth and leisure, through an alluvial morass into the sea. In 2 hours El Nacional entered the river's mouth. The banks were crowded with a disposition of formidable trees. The sumptuous undergrowth of the tropics overflowed the land and drowned itself in the fallow waters. Silently the sloop entered there and met a deeper silence, brilliant with greens and ochres and floral scarlets. The umbrageous mouth of the Rio Ruiz furnished no sound or movement save of the sea-going water as it purled against the prow of the vessel. Small chance there seemed of wresting beef or provisions from that empty solitude. The admiral decided to cast anchor, and, at the chain's rattle, the forest was stimulated to instant and resounding uproar. The mouth of the Rio Ruiz had only been taking a morning nap. Parrots and baboons screeched and barked in the trees. A whirring and a hissing and a booming marked the awakening of animal life. A dark blue bulk was visible for an instant, as a startled tapir fought his way through the vines. The Navy, under orders, hung in the mouth of the little river for hours. The crew served the dinner of shark's fin soup, plantains, crab gumbo, and sour wine. The admiral, with a 3-foot telescope, closely scanned the impervious foliage 50 yards away. It was nearly sunset when a reverberating "Howlo-oh-oh" came from the forest to their left. It was answered, and 3 men, mounted upon mules, crashed through the tropic tangle to within a dozen yards of the river's bank. There they dismounted, and one, unbuckling his belt, struck each mule a violent blow with his sword scabbard, so that they, with a fling of heels, dashed back again into the forest. Those were strange-looking men to be conveying beef and provisions. One was a large and exceedingly active man, of striking presence. He was of the purest Spanish type, with curling, gray-besprinkled, dark hair, blue, sparkling eyes, and the pronounced air of a caballero grande. The other 2 were small, brown-faced men, wearing white military uniforms, high riding boots, and swords. The clothes of all were drenched, bespattered, and rent by the thicket. Some stress of circumstance must have driven them, diabolicator, through flood, mire, and jungle. "Ohi, Señor Almirante," called the large man, "send to us your boat." The dory was lowered, and Felipe, with one of the Caribs, rowed toward the left bank. The large man stood near the water's brink, waist deep in the curling vines. As he gazed upon the scarecrow figure in the stern of the dory, a sprightly interest beamed upon his mobile face. Months of wageless and thankless service had dimmed the admiral's splendor. His red trousers were patched and ragged. Most of the bright buttons and yellow braid were gone from his jacket. The visor of his cap was torn and depended almost to his eyes. The admiral's feet were bare. "Dear Admiral," cried the large man, and his voice was like a blast from a horn, "I kiss your hands. I knew we could build upon your fidelity. You had our dispatch from General Martinez. A little nearer with your boat, dear Admiral. Upon these devils of shifting vines we stand with the smallest security." Felipe regarded him with a stolid face. "Provisions and beef for the barracks at Alforan," he quoted. "No fault of the butchers, Almirante mio, that the beef awaits you not. But you are come in time to save the cattle. Get us aboard your vessel, Señor, at once. You first, caballeros a prisa. Come back for me. The boat is too small." The dory conveyed the 2 officers to the sloop and returned for the large man. "Have you so gross a thing as food, good Admiral?" he cried when aboard. "And perhaps coffee, beef, and provisions. Nombre de Dios. A little longer, and we could have eaten one of those mules that you, Colonel Raphael, saluted so feelingly with your sword scabbard at parting. Let us have food, and then we will sail for the barracks at Alforno." The Caribs prepared a meal, to which the 3 passengers of El Nacional set themselves with famished delight. About sunset, as was its custom, the breeze veered and swept back from the mountains, cool and steady, bringing a taste of the stagnant lagoons and mangrove swamps that guttered the lowlands. The mainsail of the sloop was hoisted and swelled to it, and at that moment they heard shouts and a waxing clamor from the bosky profundities of the shore. "The butchers, my dear Admiral," said the large man, smiling, too late for the slaughter. Further than his orders to his crew, the Admiral was saying nothing. The topsail and jib were spread, and the sloop alighted out of the estuary. The large man and his companions had bestowed themselves with what comfort they could about the bare deck. Belike, the thing big in their minds had been their departure from that critical shore. And now that the hazard was so far reduced, their thoughts were loosed to the consideration of further deliverance. But when they saw the sloop turn and fly up coast again, they relaxed, satisfied with the course the admiral had taken. The large man sat at ease, his spirited blue eye engaged in the contemplation of the Navy's commander. He was trying to estimate this somber and fantastic lad, whose impenetrable stolidity puzzled him. Himself a fugitive, his life sought, and chafing under the smart of defeat and failure, it was characteristic of him to transfer instantly his interest to the study of a thing new to him. It was like him, too, to have conceived and risked all upon this last desperate and madcap scheme, this message to a poor, crazed fanatico cruising about with his grotesque uniform and his farcical title. But his companions had been at their wits' end. Escape had seemed incredible, and now he was pleased with the success of the plan they had called crack-brained and precarious. The brief, tropic twilight seemed to slide swiftly into the pearly splendor of a moonlit night. And now the lights of Coralio appeared, distributed against the darkening shore to their right. The admiral stood, silent, at the tiller. The Caribs, like black panthers, held the sheets, leaping noiselessly at his short commands. The three passengers were watching intently the sea before them, and when at length they came in sight of the bulk of a steamer lying a mile out from the town, with her lights radiating deep into the water, they held a sudden voluble and close-headed converse. The sloop was speeding as if to strike midway between ship and shore. The large man suddenly separated from his companions and approached the scarecrow at the helm. "My dear Admiral," he said, "the government has been exceedingly remiss. I feel all the shame for it that only its ignorance of your devoted service has prevented it from sustaining. An inexcusable oversight has been made. A vessel, a uniform, and a crew worthy of your fidelity shall be furnished you. But just now, dear Admiral, there is business of moment afoot. The steamer lying there is the Salvador. I and my friends desire to be conveyed to her, where we are sent on the government's business. Do us the favor to shape your course accordingly." Without replying, the admiral gave a sharp command and put the tiller hard to port. El Nacional swerved and headed straight as an arrow's course for the shore. "Do me the favor," said the large man, a trifle restively, "to acknowledge, at least, that you catch the sound of my words." It was possible that the fellow might be lacking in senses as well as intellect. The admiral emitted a croaking, harsh laugh and spake. "They will stand you," he said, "with your face to a wall and shoot you dead. That is the way they kill traitors. I knew you when you stepped into my boat. I have seen your picture in a book. You are Sabas Placido, traitor to your country, with your face to a wall. So, you will die. I am the admiral, and I will take you to them, with your face to a wall. Yes." Don Sabas half turned and waved his hand, with a ringing laugh, toward his fellow fugitives. "To you, caballeros, I have related the history of that session when we issued that so ridiculous commission. Of a truth, our jest has been turned against us. Behold the Frankenstein's monster we have created." Don Sabas glanced toward the shore. The lights of Coralio were drawing near. He could see the beach, the warehouse of the Bodega Nacional, the long, low cuartel occupied by the soldiers, and behind that, gleaming in the moonlight, a stretch of high adobe wall. He had seen men stood with their faces to that wall and shot dead. Again he addressed the extravagant figure at the helm. "It is true," he said, "that I am fleeing the country, but receive the assurance that I care very little for that. Courts and camps everywhere are open to Sabas Placido. Vaya, what is this molehill of a republic, this pig's head of a country to a man like me? I am a paisano of everywhere. In Rome, in London, in Paris, in Vienna, you will hear them say, 'Welcome back, Don Sabas. Come, Tonto, baboon of a boy admiral, whatever you call yourself, turn your boat. Put us on board the Salvador, and here is your pay 500 pesos in money of the Estados Unidos, more than your lying government will pay you in 20 years. Don Sabas pressed a plump purse against the youth's hand. The admiral gave no heed to the words or the movement. braced against the helm, he was holding the sloop dead on her shoreward course. His dull face was lit almost to intelligence by some inward conceit that seemed to afford him joy, and found utterance in another parrot-like cackle. "That is why they do it," he said, "so that you will not see the guns. They fireboom, and you fall dead, with your face to the wall." Yes. The admiral called a sudden order to his crew. The lithe, silent Caribs made fast the sheets they held, and slipped down the hatchway into the hold of the sloop. When the last one had disappeared, Don Sabas, like a big, brown leopard, leaped forward, closed and fastened the hatch and stood, smiling. "No rifles, if you please, dear Admiral," he said. "It was a whimsy of mine once to compile a dictionary of the Carib lingua. So, I understood your order. Perhaps now you will." He cut short his words, for he heard the dull swish of iron scraping along tin. The Admiral had drawn the cutlass of Pedro Lafitte and was darting upon him. The blade descended, and it was only by a display of surprising agility that the large man escaped, with only a bruised shoulder, the glancing weapon. He was drawing his pistol as he sprang, and the next instant he shot the Admiral down. Don Sabas stooped over him and rose again. "In the heart," he said briefly. "Señores, the Navy is abolished." Colonel Raphael sprang to the helm, and the other officer hastened to loose the mainsail sheets. The boom swung round. El Nacional veered and began to tack industriously for the Salvador. "Strike that flag, señor," called Colonel Raphael. "Our friends on the steamer will wonder why we are sailing under it." "Well said," cried Don Sabas. Advancing to the mast, he lowered the flag to the deck, where lay its too loyal supporter. Thus ended the Minister of War's little piece of after-dinner drollery, and by the same hand that began it. Suddenly Don Sabas gave a great cry of joy, and ran down the slanting deck to the side of Colonel Raphael. Across his arm he carried the flag of the extinguished navy. "Mira, mira, señor. Ah, Dios. Already can I hear that great bear of an Oestreicher shout, 'Du hast mein Herz gebrochen.' Meyer, of my friend, Herr Grunitz, of Vienna, you have heard me relate. That man has traveled to Ceylon for an orchid, to Patagonia for a headdress, to Benares for a slip, or to Mozambique for a spearhead, to add to his famous collections. Thou knowest, also, amigo Raphael, that I have been a gatherer of curios. My collection of battle flags of the world's navies was the most complete in existence until last year. Then Herr Grunitz secured 2 such rare specimens, one of a Barbary state, and one of the Makarurus, a tribe on the west coast of Africa. I have not those, but they can be procured. But this flag, Senor, do you know what it is? Name of God, do you know? See that red cross upon the blue and white ground. You never saw it before?
Seguramente no.
It is the naval flag of your country." "Meyer! This rotten tub we stand upon is its navy. That dead cockatoo lying there was its commander. That stroke of cutlass and single pistol shot a sea battle. All a piece of absurd foolery, I grant you, but authentic. There has never been another flag like this, and there never will be another. No, it is unique in the whole world. Yes, think of what that means to a collector of flags. Do you know, Coronel mio, how many golden crowns Herr Grunitz would give for this flag? 10,000, likely. Well, 100,000 would not buy it. Beautiful flag. Only flag. Little devil of a most heaven-born flag. Oh hey, old grumbler beyond the ocean. Wait till Don Sabas comes again to the Konigenstrasse. He will let you kneel and touch the folds of it with one finger. Oh he, old spectacled ransacker of the world. Forgotten was the impotent revolution, the danger, the loss, the gall of defeat. Possessed solely by the inordinate and unparalleled passion of the collector, he strode up and down the little deck, clasping to his breast with one hand the paragon of a flag. He snapped his fingers triumphantly toward the east. He shouted the paean to his prize in trumpet tones, as though he would make old Grunitz hear in his musty din beyond the sea. They were waiting on the Salvador to welcome them. The sloop came close alongside the steamer, where her sides were sliced almost to the lower deck for the loading of fruit. The sailors of the Salvador grappled and held her there. Captain McLeod leaned over the side. "Well, senor, the jig is up, I'm told." "The jig is up?" Don Sabas looked perplexed for a moment. "That revolutiona, yes?" With a shrug of his shoulders, he dismissed the matter. The captain learned of the escape and the imprisoned crew. "Caribs," he said, "no harm in them." He slipped down into the sloop and kicked loose the hasp of the hatch. The black fellows came tumbling up, sweating but grinning. "Hey, black boys," said the captain in a dialect of his own. "You sabe, catchy boat and vamos back same place quick." They saw him point to themselves, the sloop and Corralio. "Yas, yas," they cried, with broader grins and many nods. The four Don Sabas, the two officers, and the captain moved to quit the sloop. Don Sabas lagged a little behind, looking at the still form of the late admiral, sprawled in his paltry trappings. "Pobrecito loco," he said softly. He was a brilliant cosmopolite and a Cognoscenti of high rank. But, after all, he was of the same race and blood and instinct as this people. Even as the simple paisanos of Corralio had said it, so said Don Sabas. Without a smile, he looked and said, "The poor little crazed one." Stooping, he raised the limp shoulders, drew the priceless and induplicable flag under them and over the breast, pinning it there with the diamond star of the Order of San Carlos that he took from the collar of his own coat. He followed after the others, and stood with them upon the deck of the Salvador. The sailors that steadied El Nacional shoved her off. The jabbering Caribs hauled away at the rigging. The sloop headed for the shore. And her Grunit's collection of naval flags was still the finest in the world. The Fifth Wheel, by O. Henry. The ranks of the bed line moved closer together, for it was cold. They were alluvial deposit of the stream of life, lodged in the delta of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. The bedliners stamped their freezing feet, looked at the empty benches in Madison Square whence Jack Frost had evicted them, and muttered to one another in a confusion of tongues. The Flatiron Building, with its impious, cloud-piercing architecture looming mistily above them on the opposite delta, might well have stood for the Tower of Babel, whence these polyglot idlers had been called by the winged walking delegate of the Lord. Standing on a pine box a head higher than his flock of goats, the preacher exhorted whatever transient and shifting audience the north wind doled out to him. It was a slave market. 15 cents bought you a man. You deeded him to Morpheus, and the recording angel gave you credit. The preacher was incredibly earnest and unwearied. He had looked over the list of things one may do for one's fellow man, and had assumed for himself the task of putting to bed all who might apply at his soapbox on the nights of Wednesday and Sunday. That left but 5 nights for other philanthropists to handle. And had they done their part as well, this wicked city might have become a vast Arcadian dormitory where all might snooze and snore the happy hours away, letting problem plays and the rent man and business go to the deuce. The hour of 8 was but a little while past. Sightseers in a small, dark mass of pay or were gathered in the shadow of General Worth's monument. Now and then, shyly, ostentatiously, carelessly, or with conscientious exactness, one would step forward and bestow upon the preacher small bills or silver. Then a lieutenant of Scandinavian coloring and enthusiasm would march away to a lodging house with a squad of the redeemed. All the while the preacher exhorted the crowd in terms beautifully devoid of eloquence, splendid with the deadly, accusative monotony of truth. Before the picture of the bedliners fades, you must hear one phrase of the preacher's, the one that formed his theme that night. It is worthy of being stenciled on all the white ribbons in the world. Underscore, no man ever learned to be a drunkard on 5-cent whiskey. Think of it, Tippler. It covers the ground from the sprouting rye to the potter's field. A clean-profiled, erect young man in the rear rank of the bedless emulated the terrapin, drawing his head far down into the shell of his coat collar. It was a well-cut tweed coat, and the trousers still showed signs of having flattened themselves beneath the compelling goose. But, conscientiously, I must warn the milliner's apprentice who reads this, expecting a Reginald Montresor in straits, to peruse no further. The young man was no other than Thomas McQuaid, ex-coachman, discharged for drunkenness 1 month before, and now reduced to the grimy ranks of the one-night bed seekers. If you live in smaller New York, you must know the Van Smythe family carriage, drawn by the two 1,500-pound, 100-to-1 shop bays. The carriage is shaped like a bathtub. In each end of it reclines an old lady Van Smythe holding a black sunshade the size of a New Year's Eve feather tickler. Before his downfall, Thomas McQuaid drove the Van Smythe bays and was himself driven by Annie, the Van Smythe lady's maid. But it is one of the saddest things about romance that a tight shoe or an empty commissary or an aching tooth will make a temporary heretic of any Cupid worshipper. And Thomas's physical troubles were not few. Therefore, his soul was less vexed with thoughts of his lost lady's maid than it was by the fancied presence of certain non-existent things that his racked nerves almost convinced him were flying, dancing, crawling, and wriggling on the asphalt and in the air above and around the dismal campus of the Bedline Army. Nearly 4 weeks of straight whiskey and a diet limited to crackers, bologna, and pickles often guarantees a psychozoological sequel. Thus desperate, freezing, angry, beset by phantoms as he was, he felt the need of human sympathy and intercourse. The bedliner standing at his right was a young man of about his own age, shabby but neat. "What's the diagnosis of your case, Freddie?" asked Thomas, with the Freemasonic familiarity of the damned. "Booze. That's mine. You don't look like a panhandler." "Neither am I. A month ago, I was pushing the lines over the backs of the finest team of Percheron buffaloes that ever made their mile down Fifth Avenue in 2.85. And look at me now. Say, how do you come to be at this bed bargain counter rummage sale?" The other young man seemed to welcome the advances of the airy ex-coachman. "No," said he, "mine isn't exactly a case of drink, unless we allow that Cupid is a bartender. I married unwisely, according to the opinion of my unforgiving relatives. I've been out of work for a year because I don't know how to work, and I've been sick in Bellevue and other hospitals for months. My wife and kid had to go back to her mother. I was turned out of the hospital yesterday, and I haven't a cent. That's my tale of woe." "Tough luck," said Thomas. "A man alone can pull through all right, but I hate to see the women and kids get the worst of it." Just then there hummed up Fifth Avenue a motor car so splendid, so red, so smoothly running, so craftily demolishing the speed regulations that it drew the attention even of the listless bedliners. Suspended and pinioned on its left side was an extra tire. When opposite the unfortunate company, the fastenings of this tire became loosed. It fell to the asphalt, bounded and rolled rapidly in the wake of the flying car. Thomas McQuaid, scenting an opportunity, darted from his place among the preacher's goats. In 30 seconds he had caught the rolling tire, swung it over his shoulder, and was trotting smartly after the car. On both sides of the avenue people were shouting, whistling, and waving canes at the red car, pointing to the enterprising Thomas coming up with the lost tire. $1, Thomas had estimated, was the smallest guerdon that so grand an automobilist could offer for the service he had rendered and save his pride. 2 blocks away the car had stopped. There was a little, brown, muffled chauffeur driving, and an imposing gentleman wearing a magnificent sealskin coat and a silk hat on a rear seat. Thomas proffered the captured tire with his best ex-coachman manner and a look in the brighter of his reddened eyes that was meant to be suggestive to the extent of a silver coin or two and receptive up to higher denominations. But the look was not so construed. The sealskin gentleman received the tire, placed it inside the car, gazed intently at the ex-coachman, and muttered to himself inscrutable words. "Strange, strange," said he. "Once or twice even I, myself, have fancied that the Chaldean gyroscope has availed. Could it be possible?" Then he addressed less mysterious words to the waiting and hopeful Thomas. "Sir, I thank you for your kind rescue of my tire. And I would ask you, if I may, a question. Do you know the family of Van Smythes living in Washington Square North?" "Oughtn't I to?" replied Thomas. "I live there. Wish I did yet." The sealskin gentleman opened a door of the car. "Step in, please," he said. "You have been expected." Thomas McQuaid obeyed with surprise, but without hesitation. A seat in a motor car seemed better than standing room in the bedline. But after the laprobe had been tucked about him and the auto had sped on its course, the peculiarity of the invitation lingered in his mind. Maybe the guy hasn't got any change, was his diagnosis. Lots of these swell rounders don't lug about any ready money. Guess he'll dump me out when he gets to some joint where he can get cash on his mug. Anyhow, it's a cinch that I've got that open-air bed convention beat to a finish. Submerged in his greatcoat, the mysterious automobilist seemed, himself, to marvel at the surprises of life. Wonderful, amazing, strange, he repeated to himself constantly. When the car had well entered the crosstown 70s, it swung eastward a half block and stopped before a row of high-stooped, brownstone front houses. "Be kind enough to enter my house with me," said the sealskin gentleman when they had alighted. "He's going to dig up, sure," reflected Thomas, following him inside. There was a dim light in the hall. His host conducted him through a door to the left, closing it after him and leaving them in absolute darkness. Suddenly a luminous globe, strangely decorated, shone faintly in the center of an immense room that seemed to Thomas more splendidly appointed than any he had ever seen on the stage or read of in fairy tales. The walls were hidden by gorgeous red hangings embroidered with fantastic gold figures. At the rear end of the room were draped portieres of dull gold spangled with silver crescents and stars. The furniture was of the costliest and rarest styles. The ex-coachman's feet sank into rugs as fleecy and deep as snowdrifts. There were 3 or 4 oddly shaped stands or tables covered with black velvet drapery. Thomas McQuaid took in the splendors of this palatial apartment with one eye. With the other, he looked for his imposing conductor to find that he had disappeared. "Gee," muttered Thomas, "this listens like a spook shop. Shouldn't wonder if it ain't one of these Moravian Nights adventures that you read about. Wonder what became of the furry guy." Suddenly a stuffed owl that stood on an ebony perch near the illuminated globe slowly raised his wings and emitted from his eyes a brilliant electric glow. With a fright-born imprecation, Thomas seized a bronze statuette of Hebe from a cabinet nearby and hurled it with all his might at the terrifying and impossible fowl. The owl and his perch went over with a crash. With the sound there was a click, and the room was flooded with light from a dozen frosted globes along the walls and ceiling. The gold portieres parted and closed, and the mysterious automobilist entered the room. He was tall and wore evening dress of perfect cut and accurate taste. A Van Dyke beard of glossy, golden brown, rather long and wavy hair, smoothly parted, and large, magnetic, orientally occult eyes gave him a most impressive and striking appearance. If you can conceive a Russian Grand Duke in a Raja's throne room advancing to greet a visiting emperor, you will gather something of the majesty of his manner. But Thomas McQuaid was too near his to be mindful of his When he viewed this silken, polished, and somewhat terrifying host, he thought vaguely of dentists. "Say, Doc," said he resentfully, "that's a hot bird you keep on tap. I hope I didn't break anything, but I've nearly got the Willawalloos," and when he threw them 32 candle power lamps of his on me, I took a snapshot at him with that little brass flatiron girl that stood on the sideboard. "That is merely a mechanical toy," said the gentleman with a wave of his hand. "May I ask you to be seated while I explain why I brought you to my house? Perhaps you would not understand, nor be in sympathy with the psychological prompting that caused me to do so. So I will come to the point at once by venturing to refer to your admission that you know the Van Smythe family of Washington Square North." "Any silver missing?" asked Thomas tartly. "Any jewelry displaced? Of course I know him. Any of the old lady's sunshades disappeared? Well, I know him. And then what?" The Grand Duke rubbed his white hands together softly. "Wonderful," he murmured. "Wonderful. Shall I come to believe in the Chaldean gyroscope myself? Let me assure you," he continued, "that there is nothing for you to fear. Instead, I think I can promise you that very good fortune awaits you. We will see." "Do they want me back?" asked Thomas, with something of his old professional pride in his voice. "I'll promise to cut out the booze and do the right thing if they'll try me again. But how did you get wise, Doc?" "Gee, it's the swellest employment agency I was ever in, with its flashlight owls and so forth." With an indulgent smile, the gracious host begged to be excused for 2 minutes. He went out to the sidewalk and gave an order to the chauffeur, who still waited with the car. Returning to the mysterious apartment, he sat by his guest and began to entertain him so well by his witty and genial converse that the poor bed-liner almost forgot the cold streets from which he had been so recently and so singularly rescued. A servant brought some tender cold fowl and tea biscuits and a glass of miraculous wine, and Thomas felt the glamour of Arabia envelop him. Thus half an hour sped quickly, and then the honk of the returned motor car at the door suddenly drew the Grand Duke to his feet, with another soft petition for a brief absence. Two women, well muffled against the cold, were admitted at the front door and suavely conducted by the master of the house down the hall through another door to the left and into a smaller room, which was screened and segregated from the larger front room by heavy, double portieres. Here the furnishings were even more elegant and exquisitely tasteful than in the other. On a gold-inlaid rosewood table were scattered sheets of white paper and a queer, triangular instrument or toy, apparently of gold, standing on little wheels. The taller woman threw back her black veil and loosened her cloak. She was 50, with a wrinkled and sad face. The other, young and plump, took a chair a little distance away, into the rear as a servant or an attendant might have done. "You sent for me, Professor Cherubusco," said the elder woman wearily. "I hope you have something more definite than usual to say. I've about lost the little faith I had in your art. I would not have responded to your call this evening if my sister had not insisted upon it." "Madam," said the professor, with his princeliest smile, "the true art cannot fail. To find the true psychic and potential branch sometimes requires time. We have not succeeded, I admit, with the cards, the crystal, the stars, the magic formulae of Zarazin, nor the oracle of Puh. But we have at last discovered the true psychic route. The Chaldean gyroscope has been successful in our search." The professor's voice had a ring that seemed to proclaim his belief in his own words. The elderly lady looked at him with a little more interest. "Why, there was no sense in those words that it wrote with my hands on it," she said. "What do you mean?" "The words were these," said Professor Cherubusco, rising to his full magnificent height. "By the fifth wheel of the chariot he shall come." "I haven't seen many chariots," said the lady, "but I never saw one with 5 wheels." "Progress," said the professor, "progress in science and mechanics has accomplished it, though, to be exact, we may speak of it only as an extra tire. Progress in occult art has advanced in proportion. Madam, I repeat that the Chaldean gyroscope has succeeded. I can not only answer the question that you have propounded, but I can produce before your eyes the proof thereof." And now the lady was disturbed both in her disbelief and in her poise. "Oh, Professor," she cried anxiously, "when? Where? Has he been found? Do not keep me in suspense." "I beg you will excuse me for a very few minutes," said Professor Cherubusco, "and I think I can demonstrate to you the efficacy of the true art." Thomas was contentedly munching the last crumbs of the bread and fowl when the enchanter appeared suddenly at his side. "Are you willing to return to your old home if you are assured of a welcome and restoration to favor?" he asked, with his courteous, royal smile. "Do I look bughouse?" answered Thomas. "Enough of the footback life for me. But will they have me again? The old lady is as fixed in her ways as a nut on a new axle." "My dear young man," said the other, "she has been searching for you everywhere." "Great," said Thomas. "I'm on the job. That team of dropsical dromedaries they call horses is a handicap for a first-class coachman like myself, but I'll take the job back. Sure, Doc. They're good people to be with." And now a change came over the suave countenance of the Caliph of Baghdad. He looked keenly and suspiciously at the ex-coachman. "May I ask what your name is?" he said shortly. "You've been looking for me," said Thomas, "and don't know my name? You're a funny kind of sleuth. You must be one of the central office gumshoers. I'm Thomas McQuaid, of course, and I've been chauffeur of the Van Smythe Elephant team for a year. They fired me a month ago for, well, Doc, you saw what I did to your old owl. I went broke on booze, and when I saw the tire drop off your wagon, I was standing in that squad of hobos at the Worth Monument waiting for a free bed. Now, what's the prize for the best answer to all this?" To his intense surprise, Thomas felt himself lifted by the collar and dragged, without a word of explanation, to the front door. This was opened, and he was kicked forcibly down the steps with one heavy, disillusionizing, humiliating impact of the stupendous Arabian's shoe. As soon as the ex-coachman had recovered his feet and his wits, he hastened as fast as he could eastward toward Broadway. Crazy guy, was his estimate of the mysterious automobilist. Just wanted to have some fun kiddin', I guess. He might have dug up $1, anyhow. Now I've got to hurry up and get back to that gang of bum bed hunters before they all get preached to sleep. When Thomas reached the end of his 2-mile walk, he found the ranks of the homeless reduced to a squad of perhaps 8 or 10. He took the proper place of a newcomer at the left end of the rear rank. In a file in front of him was the young man who had spoken to him of hospitals and something of a wife and child. "Sorry to see you back again," said the young man, turning to speak to him. "I hoped you had struck something better than this." "Me?" said Thomas. "Oh, I just took a run around the block to keep warm. I see the public ain't lending to the Lord very fast tonight." "In this kind of weather," said the young man, "charity avails itself of the proverb, and both begins and ends at home." And the preacher and his vehement lieutenant struck up a last hymn of petition to Providence and man. Those of the bedliners whose windpipes still registered above 32 degrees hopelessly and tunelessly joined in. In the middle of the second verse, Thomas saw a sturdy girl with wind-tossed drapery battling against the breeze and coming straight toward him from the opposite sidewalk. "Annie!" he yelled and ran toward her. "You fool, you fool!" she cried, weeping and laughing, and hanging upon his neck. "Why did you do it?" "The stuff," explained Thomas briefly. "You know," but subsequently knit. "Not a drop." He led her to the curb. "How did you happen to see me?" "I came to find you," said Annie, holding tight to his sleeve. "Oh, you big fool. Professor Cherubusco told us that we might find you here." "Professor Ch. Don't know the guy. What saloon does he work in?" "He's a clairvoyant, Thomas, the greatest in the world. He found you with the Chaldean telescope," he said. "He's a liar," said Thomas. "I never had it. He never saw me have anybody's telescope. And he said you came in a chariot with 5 wheels or something." "Annie," said Tom solicitously, "you're giving me the wheels now. If I had a chariot, I'd have gone to bed in it long ago. And without any singing and preaching for a nightcap, either. Listen, you big fool. The missus says she'll take you back. I begged her to, but you must behave. And you can go up to the house tonight, and your old room over the stable is ready." "Great," said Thomas earnestly. "You are it, Annie. But when did these stunts happen?" "Tonight at Professor Cherubusco's. He sent his automobile for the missus, and she took me along. I've been there with her before." "What's the professor's line?" "He's a clairvoyant and a witch. The missus consults him. He knows everything. But he hasn't done the missus any good yet, though she's paid him hundreds of dollars. But he told us that the stars told him we could find you here." "What's the old lady want this cherry buster to do?" "That's a family secret," said Annie. "And now you've asked enough questions. Come on home, you big fool." They had moved but a little way up the street when Thomas stopped. "Got any dough with you, Annie?" he asked. Annie looked at him sharply. "Oh, I know what that look means," said Thomas. "You're wrong. Not another drop. But there's a guy that was standing next to me in the bed line over there that's in bad shape. He's the right kind, and he's got wives or kids or something, and he's on the sick list.
No bus.
If you could dig up $50 for him, so he could get a decent bed, I'd like it." Annie's fingers began to wiggle in her purse. "Sure, I've got money," said she. "Lots of it."
$12.
And then she added, with woman's ineradicable suspicion of vicarious benevolence, "Bring him here and let me see him first." Thomas went on his mission. The wan bedliner came readily enough. As the two drew near, Annie looked up from her purse and screamed, "Mr. Walter, oh Mr. Walter." "Is that you, Annie?" said the young man meekly. "Oh, Mr. Walter, and the missus hunting high and low for you." "Does mother want to see me?" he asked, with a flush coming out on his pale cheek. "She's been hunting for you high and low. Sure, she wants to see you. She wants you to come home. She's tried police and morgues and lawyers and advertising and detectives and rewards and everything. And then she took up clairvoyance. You'll go right home. Won't you, Mr. Walter?" "Gladly, if she wants me," said the young man. "3 years is a long time. I suppose I'll have to walk up, though, unless the streetcars are giving free rides. I used to walk and beat that old plug team of bays we used to drive to the carriage. Have they got them yet?" "They have," said Thomas, feelingly, "and they'll have him 10 years from now. The life of the Royal Elephantibus Truckhorsebus is 149 years. I'm the coachman. Just got my reappointment 5 minutes ago. Let's all ride up in a surface car that is if Annie will pay the fares." On the Broadway car, Annie handed each one of the prodigals a nickel to pay the conductor. "Seems to me you are mighty reckless the way you throw large sums of money around," said Thomas sarcastically. "In that purse," said Annie decidedly, "is exactly $11.85. I shall take every cent of it tomorrow and give it to Professor Cherubusco, the greatest man in the world." "Well," said Thomas, "I guess he must be a pretty fly guy to pipe off things the way he does. I'm glad his spooks told him where you could find me. If you'll give me his address, someday I'll go up there, myself, and shake his hand." Presently Thomas moved tentatively in his seat, and thoughtfully felt an abrasion or two on his knees and his elbows. "Say, Annie," said he confidentially, "maybe it's one of the last dreams of booze, but I've a kind of a recollection of riding in an automobile with a swell guy that took me to a house full of eagles and arc lights. He fed me on biscuits and hot air, and then kicked me down the front steps. If it was the why am I so sore?" "Shut up, you fool," said Annie. "If I could find that funny guy's house," said Thomas in conclusion, "I'd go up there some day and punch his nose for him." The Fairy of Unfulfillment by O. Henry. At the street corner, as solid as granite in the rush-hour tide of humanity, stood the man from Nome. The Arctic winds and sun had stained him berry brown. His eyes still held the azure glint of the glaciers. He was as alert as a fox, as tough as a caribou cutlet, and as broad-gauged as the aurora borealis. He stood sprayed by a Niagara of sound, the crash of the elevated trains, clanging cars, pounding of rubberless tires, and the antiphony of the cab and truck drivers indulging in scarifying repartee. And so, with his gold dust cashed into the merry air of 100,000, and with the cakes and ale of 1 week in Gotham turning bitter on his tongue, the man from Nome sighed to set foot again in Chilkoot, the exit from the land of street noises and Dead Sea apple pies. Up 6th Avenue, with the tripping, scurrying, chattering, bright-eyed, homing tide came the girl from Sieber Mason's. The man from Nome looked and saw, first, that she was supremely beautiful after his own conception of beauty, and next, that she moved with exactly the steady grace of a dog sled on a level crust of snow. His third sensation was an instantaneous conviction that he desired her greatly for his own. This quickly do men from Nome make up their minds. Besides, he was going back to the north in a short time, and to act quickly was no less necessary. 1,000 girls from the great department store of Sieber Mason flowed along the sidewalk, making navigation dangerous to men whose feminine field of vision for 3 years has been chiefly limited to Siwash and Chilkat squaws. But the man from Nome, loyal to her who had resurrected his long-cached heart, plunged into the stream of pulchritude and followed her. Down 23rd Street she glided swiftly, looking to neither side. No more flirtatious than the bronze Diana above the garden. Her fine brown hair was neatly braided. Her neat waist and unwrinkled black skirt were eloquent of the double virtues taste and economy. 10 yards behind followed the smitten man from Nome. Miss Claribel Colby, the girl from Sieber Mason's, belonged to that sad company of mariners known as Jersey commuters. She walked into the waiting room of the ferry and up the stairs, and by a marvelous swift little run, caught the ferry boat that was just going out. The man from Nome closed up his 10 yards in 3 jumps and gained the deck close beside her. Miss Colby chose a rather lonely seat on the outside of the upper cabin. The night was not cold, and she desired to be away from the curious eyes and tedious voices of the passengers. Besides, she was extremely weary and drooping from lack of sleep. On the previous night she had graced the annual ball and oyster fry of the West Side Wholesale Fish Dealers Assistants Social Club No. 2, thus reducing her usual time of sleep to only 3 hours. And the day had been uncommonly troublous. Customers had been inordinately trying. The buyer in her department had scolded her roundly for letting her stock run down. Her best friend, Mamie Tuthill, had snubbed her by going to lunch with that Dockery girl. The girl from Sieber Masons was in that relaxed, softened mood that often comes to the independent feminine wage earner. It is a mood most propitious for the man who would woo her. Then she has yearnings to be set in some home and heart, to be comforted, and to hide behind some strong arm and rest. But Miss Claribel Colby was also very sleepy. There came to her side a strong man, browned and dressed carelessly in the best of clothes, with his hat in his hand. "Lady," said the man from Nome, respectfully, "excuse me for speaking to you, but I saw you on the street, and "Oh, gee," remarked the girl from Sieber Masons, glancing up with the most capable coolness. "Ain't there any way to ever get rid of you mashers? I've tried everything from eating onions to using hatpins. Be on your way, Freddie." "I'm not one of that kind, lady," said the man from Nome. "Honest, I'm not. As I say, I saw you on the street, and I wanted to know you so bad I couldn't help following after you. I was afraid I would never see you again in this big town unless I spoke, and that's why I done so." Miss Colby looked once shrewdly at him in the dim light on the ferry boat. No, he did not have the perfidious smirk or the brazen swagger of the lady killer. Sincerity and modesty shone through his boreal tan. It seemed to her that it might be good to hear a little of what he had to say. "You may sit down," she said, laying her hand over a yawn with ostentatious politeness. "And mind, don't get fresh or I'll call the steward." The man from Nome sat by her side. He admired her greatly. He more than admired her. She had exactly the looks he had tried so long in vain to find in a woman. Could she ever come to like him? Well, that was to be seen. He must do all in his power to stake his claim, anyhow. "My name's Bladen," said he, "Henry Bladen." "Are you real sure it ain't Jones?" asked the girl, leaning toward him with delicious, knowing raillery. "I'm down from Nome," he went on with anxious seriousness. "I scraped together a pretty good lot of dust up there and brought it down with me." "Oh, say," she rippled, pursuing persiflage with engaging lightness. "Then you must be on the White Wings force. I thought I'd seen you somewhere. You didn't see me on the street today when I saw you. I never look at fellows on the street." "Well, I looked at you, and I never looked at anything before that I thought was half as pretty. Shall I keep the change?" "Yes, I reckon so. I reckon you could keep anything I've got. I reckon I'm what you would call a rough man, but I could be awful good to anybody I liked. I've had a rough time of it up yonder, but I beat the game. Nearly 5,000 ounces of dust was what I cleaned up while I was there." "Goodness!" exclaimed Miss Colby, obligingly sympathetic. "It must be an awful dirty place, wherever it is." And then her eyes closed. The voice of the man from Nome had a monotony in its very earnestness. Besides, what dull talk was this of brooms and sweeping and dust? She leaned her head back against the wall. "Miss," said the man from Nome, with deeper earnestness and monotony, "I never saw anybody I liked as well as I do you. I know you can't think that way of me right yet, but can't you give me a chance? Won't you let me know you, and see if I can't make you like me?" The head of the girl from Sieber Masons slid over gently and rested upon his shoulder. Sweet sleep had won her, and she was dreaming rapturously of the wholesale fish dealer's assistant's ball. The gentleman from Nome kept his arms to himself. He did not suspect sleep, and yet he was too wise to attribute the movement to surrender. He was greatly and blissfully thrilled, but he ended by regarding the head upon his shoulder as an encouraging preliminary, merely advanced as a harbinger of his success, and not to be taken advantage of. One small speck of alloy discounted the gold of his satisfaction. Had he spoken too freely of his wealth? He wanted to be liked for himself. "I want to say, miss," he said, "that you can count on me. They know me in the Klondike from Juneau to Circle City and down the whole length of the Yukon. Many a night I've laid in the snow up there where I worked like a slave for 3 years and wondered if I'd ever have anybody to like me. I didn't want all that dust just myself. I thought I'd meet just the right one sometime, and I done it today. Money's a mighty good thing to have, but to have the love of the one you like best is better still. If you was ever to marry a man, miss, Which would you rather he'd have?
Cash.
The word came sharply and loudly from Miss Colby's lips, giving evidence that in her dreams she was now behind her counter in the great department store of Sieber Mason. Her head suddenly bobbed over sideways. She awoke, sat straight, and rubbed her eyes. The man from Nome was gone. Gee, I believe I've been asleep, said Miss Colby. Wonder what became of the White Wings. The Exact Science of Matrimony, by O. Henry. As I have told you before, said Jeff Peters, I never had much confidence in the perfidiousness of woman. As partners or coeducators in the most innocent line of graft, they are not trustworthy. They deserve the compliment, said I. I think they are entitled to be called the honest sex. Why shouldn't they be? Said Jeff. They've got the other sex either grafting or working overtime for him. They're all right in business until they get their emotions or their hair touched up too much. Then you want to have a flat-footed, heavy-breathing man with sandy whiskers, 5 kids, and a building and loan mortgage ready as an understudy to take her desk. Now there was that widow lady that me and Andy Tucker engaged to help us in that little matrimonial agency scheme we floated out in Cairo. When you've got enough advertising capital, say a roll, as big as the little end of a wagon tongue, there's money in matrimonial agencies. We had about $6,000, and we expected to double it in 2 months, which is about as long as a scheme like ours can be carried on without taking out a New Jersey charter. We fixed up an advertisement that read about like this: charming widow, beautiful, home-loving, 32 years, possessing $3,000 cash and owning valuable country property, would remarry. Would prefer a poor man with affectionate disposition to one with means, as she realizes that the solid virtues are oftenest to be found in the humble walks of life. No objection to elderly man or one of homely appearance if faithful and true and competent to manage property and invest money with judgment. Address, with particulars. Lonely, care of Peters and Amp, Tucker, agents, Cairo, Illinois. So far, so pernicious, says I, when we had finished the literary concoction. And now, says I, where is the lady? Andy gives me one of his looks of calm irritation. Jeff, says he, I thought you had lost them ideas of realism in your art. Why should there be a lady? When they sell a lot of watered stock on Wall Street, would you expect to find a mermaid in it? What has a matrimonial ad got to do with a lady? Now listen, says I. You know my rule, Andy, that in all my illegitimate inroads against the legal letter of the law, the article sold must be existent, visible, producible. In that way, and by a careful study of city ordinances and train schedules, I have kept out of all trouble with the police that a $5 bill and a cigar could not square. Now, to work this scheme, we've got to be able to produce bodily a charming widow or its equivalent with or without the beauty, hereditaments and appurtenances set forth in the catalog and writ of errors, or hereafter be held by a justice of the peace. Well, says Andy, reconstructing his mind, maybe it would be safer in case the post office or the peace commission should try to investigate our agency. But where, he says, could you hope to find a widow who would waste time on a matrimonial scheme that had no matrimony in it? I told Andy that I thought I knew of the exact party. An old friend of mine, Zeke Trotter, who used to draw soda water and teeth in a tent show, had made his wife a widow a year before by drinking some dyspepsia cure of the old doctor's instead of the liniment that he always got boozed up on. I used to stop at their house often, and I thought we could get her to work with us. 'Twas only 60 miles to the little town where she lived, so I jumped out on the icy and finds her in the same cottage with the same sunflowers and roosters standing on the washtub. Mrs. Trotter fitted our ad first rate except, maybe for beauty and age and property valuation, but she looked feasible and praiseworthy to the eye, and it was a kindness to Zeke's memory to give her the job. Is this an honest deal you are putting on, Mr. Peters? She asks me when I tell her what we want. Mrs. Trotter, says I, Andy Tucker and me have computed the calculation that 3,000 men in this broad and unfair country will endeavor to secure your fair hand and ostensible money and property through our advertisement. Out of that number, something like 300 will expect to give you in exchange, if they should win you, the carcass of a lazy and mercenary loafer, a failure in life, a swindler and contemptible fortune seeker. Me and Andy, says I, proposed to teach these prayers upon society a lesson. It was with difficulty, says I, that me and Andy could refrain from forming a corporation under the title of the Great Moral and Millennial Malevolent Matrimonial Agency. Does that satisfy you? It does, Mr. Peters, says she. I might have known you wouldn't have gone into anything that wasn't opprobrious. But what will my duties be? Do I have to reject personally these 3,000 ramscallions you speak of, or can I throw them out in bunches? Your job, Mrs. Trotter, says I, will be practically a cynosure. You will live at a quiet hotel, and will have no work to do. Andy and I will attend to all the correspondence and business end of it. Of course, says I, some of the more ardent and impetuous suitors who can raise the railroad fare may come to Cairo to personally press their suit or whatever fraction of a suit they may be wearing. In that case, you will be probably put to the inconvenience of kicking them out face to face. We will pay you $25 per week in hotel expenses. Give me 5 minutes, says Mrs. Trotter, to get my powder rag and leave the front door key with a neighbor, and you can let my salary begin. So I conveys Mrs. Trotter to Cairo and establishes her in a family hotel, far enough away from mine and Andy's quarters to be unsuspicious and available, and I tell Andy. Great, says Andy. And now that your conscience is appeased as to the tangibility and proximity of the bait, and leaving mutton aside, suppose we revenue a no fish. So, we began to insert our advertisement in newspapers covering the country far and wide. One ad was all we used. We couldn't have used more without hiring so many clerks and marcelled paraphernalia that the sound of the gum chewing would have disturbed the postmaster, General. We placed $2,000 in a bank to Mrs. Trotter's credit and gave her the book to show in case anybody might question the honesty and good faith of the agency. I knew Mrs. Trotter was square and reliable, and it was safe to leave it in her name. With that one ad, Andy and me put in 12 hours a day answering letters. About 100 a day was what came in. I never knew there was so many large-hearted but indigent men in the country who were willing to acquire a charming widow and assume the burden of investing her money. Most of them admitted that they ran principally to whiskers and lost jobs and were misunderstood by the world, but all of them were sure that they were so chock full of affection and manly qualities that the widow would be making the bargain of her life to get him. Every applicant got a reply from Peters and Amp, Tucker informing him that the widow had been deeply impressed by his straightforward and interesting letter and requesting them to write again, stating more particulars, and enclosing photograph if convenient. Peters and Amp. Tucker also informed the applicant that their fee for handing over the second letter to their fair client would be $2, enclosed therewith. There you see the simple beauty of the scheme. About 90% of them domestic foreign noblemen raised the price somehow and sent it in. That was all there was to it. Except that me and Andy complained an amount about being put to the trouble of slicing open them envelopes and taking the money out. Some few clients called in person. We sent them to Mrs. Trotter and she did the rest, except for 3 or 4 who came back to strike us for car fare. After the letters began to get in from the RFD districts, Andy and me were taking in about $200 a day. One afternoon when we were busiest and I was stuffing the 2 and 1s into cigar boxes and Andy was whistling No Wedding Bells for her, a small slick man drops in and runs his eye over the walls like he was on the trail of a lost Gainsborough painting or two. As soon as I saw him, I felt a glow of pride, because we were running our business on the level. I see you have quite a large mail today, says the man. I reached and got my hat. Come on, says I. We've been expecting you. I'll show you the goods. How was Teddy when you left Washington? I took him down to the Riverview Hotel and had him shake hands with Mrs. Trotter. Then I showed him her bank book with the $2,000 to her credit. It seems to be all right, says the Secret Service. It is, says I. And if you're not a married man, I'll leave you to talk a while with the lady. We won't mention the $2. Thanks, says he. If I wasn't, I might. Good day, Mrs. Peters. Toward the end of 3 months, we had taken in something over $5,000, and we saw it was time to quit. We had a good many complaints made to us, and Mrs. Trotter seemed to be tired of the job. A good many suitors had been calling to see her, and she didn't seem to like that. So we decides to pull out, and I goes down to Mrs. Trotter's hotel to pay her last week's salary and say farewell and get her check for the $2,000. When I got there, I found her crying like a kid that don't want to go to school. Now, says I, what's it all about? Somebody sassed you, are you getting homesick? No, Mr. Peters, says she. I'll tell you. You was always a friend of Zeke's, and I don't mind. Mr. Peters, I'm in love. I just love a man so hard I can't bear not to get him. He's just the ideal I've always had in mind. Then take him, says I, that is, if it's a mutual case. Does he return the sentiment according to the specifications and painfulness you have described? He does, says she. But he's one of the gentlemen that's been coming to see me about the advertisement, and he won't marry me unless I give him the $2,000. His name is William Wilkinson. And then she goes off again in the agitations and hysterics of romance. Mrs. Trotter, says I, there's no man more sympathizing with a woman's affections than I am. Besides, you was once the life partner of one of my best friends. If it was left to me, I'd say take this $2,000 and the man of your choice and be happy. We could afford to do that because we have cleaned up over $5,000 from these suckers that wanted to marry you. But, says I, Andy Tucker is to be consulted. He is a good man, but keen in business. He is my equal partner financially. I will talk to Andy, says I, and see what can be done. I goes back to our hotel and lays the case before Andy. I was expecting something like this all the time, says Andy. You can't trust a woman to stick by you in any scheme that involves her emotions and preferences. It's a sad thing, Andy, says I, to think that we've been the cause of the breaking of a woman's heart. It is, says Andy, and I tell you what I'm willing to do, Jeff. You've always been a man of a soft and generous heart and disposition. Perhaps I've been too hard and worldly and suspicious. For once I'll meet you halfway. Go to Mrs. Trotter and tell her to draw the $2,000 from the bank and give it to this man she's infatuated with and be happy. I jumps up and shakes Andy's hand for 5 minutes, and then I goes back to Mrs. Trotter and tells her, and she cries as hard for joy as she did for sorrow. 2 days afterward, me and Andy packed up to go. Wouldn't you like to go down and meet Mrs. Trotter once before we leave? I asks him. She'd like mightily to know you and express her encomiums and gratitude. Why, I guess not, says Andy. I guess we'd better hurry and catch that train. I was strapping our capital around me in a memory belt like we always carried it, when Andy pulls a roll of large bills out of his pocket and asks me to put him with the rest. What's this? Says I. It's Mrs. Trotter's 2,000, says Andy. How do you come to have it? I asks. She gave it to me, says Andy. I've been calling on her 3 evenings a week for more than a month. Then are you William Wilkinson? Says I. I was, says Andy.